The rain fell in heavy sheets, blurring the city lights into a hazy glow as Emmerich steered his sleek black sedan through the near-deserted streets. The wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and the roads glistened like liquid silver under the flickering streetlights. It was a night meant for staying indoors, wrapped in warmth, but fate had other plans. As he turned a corner near an old bus stop, a fleeting shadow caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the rain, a tattered advertisement flapping in the wind or a stray animal seeking shelter. But then he saw her, a lone woman, huddled against the metal bench, cradling two tiny bundles in her arms. Emmerich slowed down, frowning. She wasn't just waiting for a bus, there hadn't been a working route on this street for years. Something about the way she clutched the babies, shielding them with her soaked coat, sent a shiver through him. Her head was bowed low, dark strands of wet hair clinging to her face, but even from inside his car, he could sense the tension in her posture. She was terrified. Emmerich wasn't the kind of man who stopped for strangers. He had spent years building a reputation, managing deals worth more than most people made in a lifetime. He had learned that getting involved in other people's problems only led to complications. And yet, his fingers tightened around the wheel, unable to ignore the nagging pull in his chest. The rain pounded harder. The babies were barely moving. Against every instinct telling him to drive away, he pulled over. Rolling down the window, he called out, "Do you need help?" His voice barely carried over the storm, but the woman flinched at the sound. Her head snapped up, revealing wide, frightened eyes that had seen too much. For a moment, she didn't move, just stared at him like a deer trapped in headlights. Then, as if making a decision in an instant, she shook her head violently. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "Please, just go." That should have been the end of it. She didn't want his help. He could have driven off, convincing himself that she was someone else's problem. But then the smallest of the two babies whimpered, a weak, barely there sound that barely rose above the rain. Something inside him twisted. The woman's lips trembled, her grip tightening around the infant's. She was desperate. And yet, she was still refusing help. That didn't make sense. He stepped out of the car, ignoring the cold rain soaking through his expensive coat. "They're freezing," he said, taking a cautious step toward her. "You are freezing. You can't stay out here." "I don't have a choice," she said quickly, her voice raw, her arms pressing the children closer as if she expected him to rip them away. "Please, just leave us alone." A flash of something, pure, unfiltered panic, flickered in her eyes before she dropped her gaze. Emmerich hesitated. She wasn't just a homeless woman down on her luck. This was something more. He could see it now, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, the way her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from fear. She was running from something. Or someone. A car passed by, its headlights slicing through the rain for a brief second before disappearing into the darkness. The woman shrank back into the shadows as if she didn't want to be seen. Every red flag in Emmerich's mind went up, but something deeper, something human, pushed him forward. "I don't know who you're hiding from," he said carefully, watching her reaction. "But I do know that if you stay out here any longer, those babies won't make it through the night." For a long, agonizing moment, she didn't respond. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her coat. Then, finally, as if the weight of the world had crushed through her last ounce of resistance, she gave the smallest nod. Without another word, Emmerich opened the back door of his car. She hesitated, looking at him as if still debating whether to trust him, then slowly, cautiously, slid into the seat. Her wet clothes left dark stains on the leather, but he didn't care. As soon as she was inside, she pulled the babies even closer, her hands shaking. Emmerich got in and turned up the heat. The woman let out a small, shaky breath as warmth filled the car, though she still looked tense. Her eyes flickered toward him as if expecting him to interrogate her, but he didn't. Not yet. They drove in silence, the rain drumming against the roof. He could feel her watching him out of the corner of her eye, her grip on the babies never loosening. She was waiting for something. But so was he. Finally, when they were a few blocks away from his home, she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They'll find us," she murmured, her tone filled with something that made his stomach turn. Emmerich glanced at her. The streetlights flickered over her pale face, making the shadows under her eyes look even darker. "Who?" he asked. Her lips parted as if to answer, but then, just as quickly, she closed them again, shaking her head. For the first time in years, a chill ran down Emmerich's spine, not from the cold, but from something much worse. What had he just brought into his home? The drive back to Emmerich's estate was silent except for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windshield. The woman sat rigid in the passenger seat, her arms locked around the babies as if she feared they'd be ripped away at any second. The dim glow of the dashboard lights cast shadows across her pale face, highlighting the deep exhaustion and silent terror buried in her eyes. Emmerich stole a glance at her, noting the way she flinched at every passing car. She wasn't just scared, she was hunted. And yet, despite the freezing rain, the exhaustion in her limbs, and the fragility of the two tiny souls in her arms, she still didn't trust him. Not fully. Emmerich wasn't sure why he cared. He had no patience for complications, and this situation screamed trouble. He was a man of logic, a businessman who dealt in cold, hard numbers, not in rescuing strangers off the street. But something about this woman, about the silent way she held on to those babies like they were her last connection to life itself, made it impossible for him to turn away. Maybe it was the way she had refused his help at first, so determined to suffer alone. Or maybe it was that last whisper in the car. "They'll find us." Two words that rattled in his mind like an unshakable warning. As they pulled into his long, gated driveway, the grand estate loomed ahead, its lights spilling a golden glow onto the wet pavement. The woman barely reacted. Most people, especially those in desperate circumstances, would be in awe of his wealth. She wasn't. If anything, she seemed even more tense, her fingers curling around the damp fabric of her coat. It was as if comfort and safety were foreign concepts to her. The car rolled to a stop, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain continued its relentless assault, but inside the car, there was only silence and the rhythmic sound of two tiny breaths. Emmerich exhaled and turned to her. "You can stay for the night," he said, his voice controlled, careful not to push. "Get warm. Rest. Then we'll figure things out." The woman said nothing. Her gaze flickered between him and the mansion, hesitation flickering behind her exhausted eyes. Then, with painstaking slowness, she nodded. Emmerich stepped out, shaking off the rain, and went around to open her door. She hesitated again before stepping out, adjusting the babies carefully to shield them from the cold. He led her inside, the warmth of the house immediately wrapping around them like a thick blanket. The moment they crossed the threshold, she stiffened. Her eyes darted around the luxurious interior, not in admiration, but in calculation. She was studying the exits. The shadows. The places she could hide. Emmerich closed the door, locking it behind them. "No one's coming in here," he assured her. She swallowed hard, not looking at him. "That's what they always say," she murmured under her breath. A strange unease settled in Emmerich's gut. He had expected gratitude, even relief, but instead, there was only suspicion and fear. Who was she running from? And why did it seem like no place in the world felt safe to her? "I'll get you some dry clothes," he said, shaking off his unease. "Follow me." She hesitated but then trailed behind him down the long hallway. The mansion was silent except for their footsteps against the polished floors. At the guest bedroom, he opened the door and gestured inside. The room was grand but simple, far too luxurious for someone who had been shivering on a street corner just minutes ago. She stepped inside cautiously, her grip still tight on the babies. "I can't leave them," she said suddenly, her voice firm. Emmerich frowned. "I wasn't asking you to." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed her face, surprise, maybe even shame. She had expected him to separate her from them. Had someone tried to take them from her before? You should eat, he added, stepping back. And get warm. I'll be downstairs. She hesitated again, as if expecting a trap, then finally gave a small nod. Emmerich shut the door behind him but lingered in the hallway for a moment. Something about this situation gnawed at him. He had dealt with high-stakes business negotiations, power-hungry investors, and even threats to his own company, but none of that had ever given him the same feeling he had right now. Downstairs, he poured himself a drink, staring into the amber liquid as if it held the answers he was looking for. Who was she? Why was she so convinced that someone was after her? And why did she seem more afraid of being helped than being left in the rain? A soft noise broke his thoughts. He turned his head just in time to see a shadow flicker at the edge of the staircase. She was watching him. He set the glass down and turned fully toward her. She stood there at the top of the stairs, the babies nestled in her arms, her wet clothes replaced by a simple sweater and leggings that were far too big for her. She looked even smaller now, almost fragile. I don't know why you helped me, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But you shouldn't have. Emmerich studied her carefully. Why? She lowered her gaze. Because now they'll come for you too. A cold chill ran through his veins. Before he could respond, the babies stirred, whimpering softly in her arms. She turned and disappeared back into the guest room, shutting the door gently behind her. Emmerich exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. What had he just gotten himself into? Emmerich barely slept that night. His mind raced, replaying every moment since he had stopped his car in the rain. He had never been the kind of man to invite chaos into his life, yet here he was, with a nameless woman and 2 fragile children sleeping under his roof, tangled in a situation that made his gut churn. Her last words echoed in his mind, because now they'll come for you too. There was weight in those words, not a desperate attempt to sound dramatic, but a quiet, exhausted certainty that sent a chill through him. She had lived this fear long enough to know how it worked. By the time the sun broke through the rain-heavy clouds, Emmerich had made a decision. He would get answers. He rose early, making his way downstairs, expecting the house to be silent. Instead, he heard soft murmurs from the kitchen. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, peering in. The woman stood at the counter, cautiously holding a spoon in her trembling fingers, attempting to stir a bowl of oatmeal. The babies lay nestled on a couch nearby, wrapped in thick blankets that nearly swallowed their tiny forms. They were quiet, too quiet. Something about that unnerved him. Babies cried. They fussed. But these 2 lay still, only their tiny chests rising and falling. You didn't sleep, Emmerich said, leaning against the doorway. She startled, nearly dropping the spoon. For a brief second, she looked like she was ready to bolt, then she caught herself. She exhaled slowly. Neither did you. It wasn't a question. It was a quiet observation, a reminder that she knew he was just as on edge as she was. Emmerich crossed the room and poured himself a coffee. He studied her as he took a slow sip. You should eat, he said. She looked down at the oatmeal, as if she had forgotten she was holding the spoon, then nodded. She took a tentative bite, chewing slowly, her eyes darting toward the babies every few seconds. Even in safety, she was prepared for disaster. Emmerich leaned back against the counter, watching her. I need to know who you are, he said finally. She tensed, her fingers tightening around the spoon. I can't tell you that. His jaw flexed. Then tell me this, who are you running from? Silence. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I can help you, but I need to know the truth. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, though there was no humor in it. You think you can help? She shook her head. You're not dealing with something you can fix by throwing money at it. Emmerich studied her carefully. Try me. She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the babies, as if debating whether to trust him. Finally, she exhaled, setting the spoon down. There are people, she said, choosing her words carefully. Powerful people. The kind that erase problems, not solve them. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. They want something. And they don't care what they have to do to get it. Emmerich's stomach tightened. He had dealt with powerful men before, corrupt politicians, ruthless businessmen, people who saw the world as a game they controlled. But this? This felt different. Darker. He glanced at the babies, then back at her. And you're the problem they want to erase? She swallowed, nodding once. Emmerich studied her for a long moment. He could see it now, the exhaustion, the fear etched into her bones. She had been running for a long time. Too long. He exhaled. You need to leave a trail, he said suddenly. She frowned. What? If you keep disappearing, they'll keep looking, he said. You need to leave something behind. Make them believe you're somewhere you're not. For the first time, she looked at him fully, her sharp, wary eyes studying him. You really don't understand who you're dealing with. Emmerich set his coffee down. No, he admitted. But I know that if they're as powerful as you say, hiding won't be enough. You have to outthink them. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but stopped. A deep, tired sigh escaped her lips. I can't do this forever, she whispered, more to herself than him. He nodded. Then let's make sure you don't have to. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then, a sharp sound cut through the morning stillness. A distant alarm, one of the motion sensors outside his estate. The woman froze, her breath catching. Emmerich's entire body tensed. Slowly, she turned her head toward him. They found us. Emmerich's blood turned to ice. Without thinking, he moved to the security panel, his fingers flying over the controls. A small screen flickered to life, showing the front gate. A sleek, unmarked black car idled just beyond the property line. No one got through his security without clearance. No one. And yet, here they were. The woman's face drained of color. Emmerich turned to her, his voice steady, despite the storm brewing in his gut. Go upstairs. Lock the door. She didn't argue. She scooped the babies up in one swift motion and disappeared down the hall. Emmerich turned back to the screen. His jaw tightened. Whoever they were, they had just made a very big mistake. Emmerich's fingers hovered over the security panel, his heartbeat a steady drum against his ribs. The screen showed the black car idling at the gate, motionless, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. There were no markings, no license plate, just tinted windows hiding the faces inside. The engine hummed, steady and patient. Whoever was inside wasn't in a hurry. That meant one thing. They knew she was here. His jaw clenched as he hit the intercom button, his voice calm, despite the unease prickling at the back of his neck. State your business. Silence. He repeated himself, but the car didn't move. No response. Just the soft hum of the rain beginning to fall again. Emmerich's fingers flexed at his sides, a slow, familiar anger brewing beneath his ribs. He didn't like games. He didn't like threats. And he definitely didn't like uninvited guests showing up at his home in the early hours of the morning, unannounced and unwelcome. He switched to the security feed covering the back entrance. Empty. Good. His property was surrounded by high walls, reinforced with surveillance that very few people even knew existed. If someone wanted to get to the house, they had to come through the front, through him. Upstairs, the woman was waiting, hidden behind locked doors. Emmerich wasn't sure if she was clutching those babies because she was afraid for them, or because they were the only thing grounding her right now. He didn't know why he cared. But he did. The intercom crackled, breaking through the static. A voice, distorted and deep, finally spoke. You have something that doesn't belong to you. Emmerich narrowed his eyes. Do I? A long pause. Send them out, and we'll leave. Them. The woman. The babies. Not a name, not even a mention of their identity. Just a transaction. Like she was property. Emmerich's fingers curled into fists. He had built his entire empire on knowing when people were lying, on understanding the games they played, the leverage they used. But this? This wasn't a business deal. This was something worse. He took a slow breath. And if I say no? A longer pause. Then, the voice on the other end gave a quiet, almost amused chuckle. Then we wait. A chill ran through him. This wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The intercom cut off. Emmerich exhaled through his nose, forcing his mind into focus. He turned from the security panel and made his way upstairs. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath. His estate had always been a fortress, a place of absolute control. But now, there were cracks in the walls, cracks in him. When he reached the guest room, he knocked once before pushing the door open. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her arms curled protectively around the babies. She looked up as he entered, her face pale, but steady. She had heard. They're not leaving, Emmerich said, his voice firm. It wasn't a question. It was a decision. She inhaled sharply, her grip tightening around the children. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to determine whether he was serious. Then, finally, she let out a breath. You don't understand, she whispered. They won't stop. Emmerich sat in the chair across from her, watching her carefully. Then start talking. Tell me who they are. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers brushing against the tiny, sleeping faces of the babies. Then, finally, she spoke. My name doesn't matter, she said softly. Not anymore. Not to them. Emmerich didn't interrupt. He just listened. She swallowed hard. I wasn't supposed to leave, she admitted. I wasn't supposed to survive. His fingers tapped against the armrest. Survive what? Her eyes met his then, and for the first time, he saw something different. Not just fear. Resignation. A program, she murmured. A system designed to erase people like me. He wasn't letting them take her. He wasn't letting them take those babies. Whoever these people were, whatever power they had just met their match. Emmerich's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the black car idling just beyond his estate's perimeter. The security cameras zoomed in, but the windows were tinted too dark to see inside. He clenched his jaw. Whoever they weren't here by accident. Upstairs, he could hear the soft rustling of the woman moving quickly, her hurried footsteps as she locked herself in the guest room with the babies. The image unsettled him, her trembling hands, the way she had looked at him before running upstairs, a mixture of fear and resignation. She expected this. She knew this was coming. Emmerich turned back to the screen. He needed to make a decision. His instincts told him to stay out of it, to let whoever was out there deal with their own business. She inhaled sharply, her grip tightening around the children. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to determine whether he was serious. Then, finally, she let out a breath. You don't understand, she whispered. They won't stop. Emmerich sat in the chair across from her, watching her carefully. Then start talking. Tell me who they are. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers brushing against the tiny, sleeping faces of the babies. Then, finally, she spoke. My name doesn't matter, she said softly. Not anymore. Not to them. Emmerich didn't interrupt. He just listened. She swallowed hard. I wasn't supposed to leave, she admitted. I wasn't supposed to survive. His fingers tapped against the armrest. Survive what? Her eyes met his then, and for the first time, he saw something different. Not just fear. Resignation. A program, she murmured. A system designed to erase people like me. A slow dread crept into Emmerich's chest. He didn't know what he had expected, some ex-lover running from a bitter divorce, a woman with debts too high to pay, maybe even a runaway from an abusive household. But this? A system designed to erase? She exhaled shakily. They took people. People who knew too much, people who were liabilities. We were trained. Conditioned. And if we failed, we disappeared. Emmerich's jaw tightened. And you escaped. A slow nod. Barely. His gaze flickered to the babies. And them? She hesitated. They were never meant to exist. That single sentence sent a wave of ice through him. They're not just after me, she continued, her voice breaking slightly. They're after them. Emmerich leaned forward, his hands clasped together. Why? She squeezed her eyes shut. Because they're proof. Proof that the people running this program are not just eliminating threats. They're creating them. The weight of her words sank deep into his chest. Outside, the black car still waited, patient, unmoving. Emmerich made his decision. He wasn't letting them take her. He wasn't letting them take those babies. Whoever these people were, whatever power they had just met their match. Emmerich's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the black car idling, just beyond his estate's perimeter. The security cameras zoomed in, but the windows were tinted too dark to see inside. He clenched his jaw. Whoever they weren't here by accident. Upstairs, he could hear the soft rustling of the woman moving quickly, her hurried footsteps as she locked herself in the guest room with the babies. The image unsettled him, her trembling hands, the way she had looked at him before running upstairs, a mixture of fear and resignation. She expected this. She knew this was coming. Emmerich turned back to the screen. He needed to make a decision. His instincts told him to stay out of it, to let whoever was out there deal with their own business. This was something bigger. Something dangerous. They're valuable, she added, voice hollow. That's why they want them back. A slow realization hit him. This wasn't about revenge or chasing down a runaway. This was about control. Those men outside weren't here to hurt her. They were here for the children. And suddenly, Emmerich understood the true weight of what he had stepped into. They think I'm weak, she continued, gripping her arms as if trying to hold herself together. That I'm scared. But I won't let them take them back. I won't. Emmerich studied her for a long moment, then made a decision. They're not getting through my gates, he said firmly. And they're not taking them. She looked at him, startled, as if she had expected him to tell her to leave, to tell her this wasn't his problem. I don't even know your name, he admitted. She hesitated, then whispered, Riona. It was the first personal thing she had shared. A name. A small piece of herself. Emmerich nodded. Then listen, Riona. You're not alone in this anymore. A sharp knock echoed from downstairs. A deliberate, patient knock. The people outside were tired of waiting. Riona paled. Emmerich's jaw tightened. They had just made a mistake. The knock at the front door was slow and deliberate, the kind that sent a chill up Emmerich's spine. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a lost traveler or the impatient tap of a deliveryman. This was different. This was calculated. A warning. Riona stood frozen beside him, her breath shallow, her arms tightening protectively around the babies. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her expression was locked in a mask of control. Emmerich didn't miss the way her body shifted instinctively, positioning herself between the children and the door, even though they were upstairs and the danger was below. Another knock. Harder this time. Emmerich exhaled slowly, forcing his muscles to relax. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. He had faced powerful men before, corporate sharks, ruthless tycoons, men who had tried to take what wasn't theirs. He had won every time. This would be no different. Stay here, he said, his voice firm but quiet. Lock the door. If anything happens, I'm not leaving them, she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once, then turned and left the room, his mind already calculating every possible scenario. As he descended the stairs, his pulse remained steady, controlled. He walked to the front door, pausing just before reaching it. His security cameras gave him a view of the outside, and the car hadn't moved. But now, standing just beyond the doorway, were two men. They were dressed in dark suits, their posture too composed, too rehearsed. These weren't thugs. These were professionals. The kind of men who walked into a room and made things disappear, whether it was money, evidence, or people. Emmerich unbolted the door, but didn't open it fully, keeping the chain lock in place. He met their eyes, unflinching. "I don't do unannounced visits." One of the men smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Emmerich, we were hoping for a brief word." His voice was smooth, practiced. "We believe you may be harboring someone who isn't supposed to be here." Emmerich's expression didn't change. "I don't take in strangers." A flicker of amusement crossed the man's face, as if he appreciated the game Emmerich was playing. "A woman. 2 children. We believe they might have found their way to your property last night." Emmerich tilted his head slightly. "Let's say they did. Why would that be your concern?" The second man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward slightly. He wasn't as polished as the first, his shoulders were too stiff, his jaw too tight. "They belong to us." The way he said it made something in Emmerich's gut twist. "They belong to us. Like objects. Not people." He held the man's gaze for a long moment before responding, his tone dangerously calm. "No one on this property belongs to anyone." The first man sighed, as if this was an inconvenience rather than a confrontation. "Mr. Emmerich, we don't want trouble. We simply need what is ours." Emmerich leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "And what exactly is yours?" There was a pause, and for the first time, Emmerich saw a crack in their composure. They hadn't expected him to push. They had expected him to fold, to hand her over, to distance himself. That told him one thing: they thought their power would be enough. It wasn't. The first man's smile faded. "You don't understand what you're interfering with." Emmerich's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I understand more than you think." The second man's patience snapped. He took another step forward, but Emmerich didn't move. He let the tension build, let them feel the weight of being unwelcome. He wanted them to know they weren't in control here. Finally, the first man exhaled. "This isn't over." Emmerich nodded once. "No, it's not." The man studied him for a second longer, then turned, signaling the other to follow. They walked back to their car, their movements careful, controlled. They weren't retreating. They were recalibrating. Emmerich shut the door and locked it, his mind already working through the next steps. They weren't gone. Not really. They were waiting. Watching. And the next time they came, they wouldn't knock. He turned and walked back upstairs, his expression unreadable as he re-entered the guest room. Riona was still standing in the same spot, her arms around the babies, her eyes locked onto his. "What did they say?" she asked, though he could already see the answer in his face. "They want you," he said. "And they're not going to stop." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, her body visibly trembling. When she opened them again, there was no more hesitation. "Then we need to disappear. Now." Emmerich nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. They had to move before it was too late. But deep down, he knew the truth. It might already be too late. Emmerich had always thought of himself as a rational man. He dealt in numbers, in risk assessments, in facts. But standing in his own home, staring at the woman clutching 2 fragile infants like they were the last thing keeping her tethered to this world, he realized logic had nothing to do with this anymore. "They won't stop," Riona whispered, her voice raw from exhaustion. "They don't know how." Her words weren't filled with panic. They weren't the dramatized warnings of someone easily spooked. They were cold. Certain. absolute. She had lived this terror long enough to know that once these people set their sights on something, or someone, they never let go. Emmerich ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. Then we need to make them believe you're gone. Riona shook her head. That won't be enough. Her grip on the babies tightened. If they think I'm dead, they'll keep looking. If they think I'm alive, they'll hunt me. She looked up at him, her eyes dark with something unreadable. The only way out of this is to make them think I'm not worth chasing anymore. He frowned. How? She hesitated, then finally spoke. They don't just want me. Her voice wavered, barely above a whisper. They want them. Emmerich felt the weight of her words sink into him like a stone. The babies. That's why she had risked everything. That's why she had been willing to die in the cold rather than turn back. It wasn't just about survival, it was about keeping them out of the wrong hands. Who are they? He asked, his voice quieter now. She hesitated, staring at the sleeping infants. They were born into something dark. Something that shouldn't exist. Her hands trembled as she spoke. I wasn't supposed to know. I was just a tool. A body. But then I found out the truth. Her breath hitched. And I ran. Emmerich studied her carefully. What truth? She swallowed hard. They were experimenting, she admitted. Not on soldiers. Not on weapons. On children. On life itself. Her eyes darkened. They wanted something pure, something untouchable. They wanted to build the perfect being. A chill crept up Emmerich's spine. He had expected to hear about money laundering, corruption, illegal trade. But this was something much worse. Riona let out a shaky breath. They created life. Then they tried to break it. To mold it into something controllable. Her gaze flickered to the babies again. But these two, they weren't supposed to survive. Emmerich stared at them, small, fragile, innocent. But were they? He had never seen infants so eerily quiet. Their tiny eyes had flickered open only once in the night, and in that brief moment, Emmerich had felt something he couldn't explain. A presence. A knowing. They have abilities, don't they? He asked, slowly. Riona nodded. Not yet. But they will. Her voice was unsteady. And that's why they want them back. Because they know what they're capable of. And they know that if these babies grow up outside of their control, they will never be able to contain them. Emmerich exhaled. This wasn't just a chase. This wasn't just about a woman on the run. This was about something far bigger. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Had he made a mistake bringing them here? Had he just signed his own death sentence? Riona must have sensed his hesitation because her voice softened. I won't blame you if you want out, she whispered. You didn't ask for this. Emmerich looked at her. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, her body half-starved and running on sheer willpower. But her eyes still burned with something fierce. A refusal to give up. A refusal to let them win. He clenched his jaw. He had spent his entire life fighting battles in the boardroom. But this? This was the first fight that actually felt like it mattered. I'm not walking away, he said finally. Riona's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected those words. They think they can chase you forever, Emmerich continued. But they've never played against someone like me. He glanced at the babies again. We're going to end this. For good. For the first time since he had met her, something in Riona's expression shifted. Not relief. Not gratitude. Hope. A sharp buzz from Emmerich's phone cut through the moment. He grabbed it, his stomach tightening when he saw the message from his security team. They're still outside. But they're not alone anymore. Emmerich's muscles tensed. They weren't waiting anymore. They were preparing. He turned back to Riona. We don't have much time. She nodded, straightening her shoulders. Then let's finish this before they do. Emmerich looked at her one last time, then turned toward the window, where the black car still sat in the distance, waiting like a vulture. They thought they were the hunters. They were about to learn what it felt like to be hunted. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Sir? Emmerich's grip on the phone was iron. Where are you? A pause. Too long. Patrolling the perimeter. Lie. Emmerich's pulse slowed, his mind sharpening. Good. Stay there. He hung up, his mind working through every possible move. If there was a mole inside his own team, they had to act now. Riona stood, her arms around the babies. What do we do? Emmerich didn't hesitate. We leave now. He moved fast, grabbing an emergency bag he had packed years ago for a situation he had never thought he'd need to face. He handed Riona a coat, pulling his own over his shoulders. A sharp sound echoed through the house, a back door opening. Riona's eyes went wide. They're inside. Emmerich's breath was steady. This was no longer just a game of strategy. This was war. He turned to her, his voice low but firm. You're going to trust me? She nodded without hesitation. He grabbed his keys, his mind already calculating their next move. Then let's go. They slipped through a hidden passageway behind one of the bookcases, a feature Emmerich had installed for security contingencies, though he had never imagined using it like this. The passage led them down to a hidden garage beneath the estate. His car sat waiting. Sleek. Bulletproof. Untraceable. He opened the door for Riona. Get in. She slid inside, clutching the babies tightly as Emmerich started the engine. The moment he pressed down on the gas, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just running anymore. He was taking the fight to them. The tires screeched against the damp pavement as Emmerich's car tore through the secluded back roads, his hands gripping the wheel with lethal precision. The rain had started again, soft at first, then growing into a steady downpour, blurring the edges of the night. Riona sat beside him, her arms wrapped protectively around the two sleeping babies, her breath coming in uneven bursts. She hadn't said a word since they'd left the estate, but she didn't need to. He could feel her fear, thick and unrelenting. Emmerich had spent years learning how to read people. Fear, greed, deception, he could spot them all within seconds. But Riona's fear was different. It wasn't just for herself. It wasn't the fear of a person trying to escape death. It was the fear of a mother, willing to do anything to protect what she loved. And that meant she would rather die than let those men take the children. The weight of that realization settled in his chest like stone. She wasn't just running. She was prepared to end it, whatever the cost. They're following us, she whispered. Emmerich didn't need to check the rearview mirror. He already knew. The headlights in the distance weren't just passing cars, they had been trailing them for miles, maintaining a perfect distance. Not too close to force a reaction. Not too far to lose them. They're waiting, Emmerich said, voice calm but cold. Riona turned to him, her expression unreadable. Emmerich pressed the gas harder, pushing the car to its limit. We have 60 seconds, he said. Riona nodded, tightening her grip on the babies. Then let's end this. As they closed in, the SUV behind them made its move. One final attempt to cut them off. But Emmerich was ready. He veered left at the last second, forcing their pursuers to react too late. The SUV swerved, its wheels skidding against the pavement as Emmerich shot forward, closing the distance to the plane. The doors opened before they had even stopped. Go. Emmerich ordered. Riona didn't hesitate. She ran, the babies held tight against her chest as she sprinted toward the waiting pilot. Emmerich turned back just in time to see the SUV regaining control. The driver threw open the door, stepping out into the rain. It was the man from his estate. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then the man smirked. You think this is over? Emmerich jaw tightened. He had one last move to play. Without breaking eye contact, he raised a small remote in his hand. The man's smirk faltered. Emmerich pressed the button. Behind him, an explosion ripped through the night, the SUV he had rigged detonating in a fiery burst. The force knocked the man back, sending him sprawling against the pavement. Emmerich didn't wait. He turned and boarded the plane, the door shutting behind him. As they lifted into the sky, Riona looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Is it over?" she asked. Emmerich exhaled, looking down at the sleeping babies. "Not yet," he admitted. But one thing was certain. He was going to make sure they never had to run again.